The biting wind howled its ancient song around the isolated facility, a stark symphony against the impenetrable black of the night sky. I often wondered if the mountain itself was trying to speak, its breath a frigid whisper against the windows of my observation chamber. Perched precariously on the mountain past my observatory was a lonely sentinel, a beacon of human curiosity against the indifferent vastness above. For years, this solitude had been my sanctuary, the silence a canvas for the cosmos, or what I thought was its logic. Tonight, however, the silence was fractured. A discordant note had begun to resonate within the intricate lattice of my instruments, a hum that defied the predictable rhythm of the celestial spheres. My eyes, accustomed to the ghost light of distant nebulae and the shimmering data streams of exoplanetary signals, were fixed on a particular array of screens. The usual chaotic dance of background radiation, the cosmic static I'd learned to filter out with practiced ease, had been interrupted. A region of space so utterly barren, so devoid of gravitational anchors or energetic emissions, it had always been dismissed as a sterile stretch of nothingness. I leaned closer, the scent of ozone and stale coffee clinging to the air around me. My fingers, calloused from countless hours at the console, danced across the holographic interface, pulling up diagnostics, recalibrating the primary sensor array, then the secondary. Every parameter I checked, every filter I applied, only intensified the anomaly. It wasn't a glitch. It was real. The signal was an intricate tapestry of frequencies, shifting and weaving with a complexity that made my mind reel. It wasn't a simple pulse, not a modulated wave, nor any form of electromagnetic radiation I could readily categorize. It was, where? Imagine a musical score composed not of notes, but of entire orchestras playing simultaneously, each melody independent yet inexplicably interwoven, creating a harmony that shouldn't exist. That was its essence. Its amplitude fluctuated with a precision that hinted at intentionality, yet its structure defied any mathematical framework I had ever encountered. It wasn't just complex, it was impossible. I rerouted all available processing power, dedicating every chip, every line of code, to isolating and analyzing the spectral intruder. The data streamed in a river of non-Euclidean geometries and self-referential loops. It didn't follow the inverse square law. Its signature shifted, not through Doppler effect, but as if it were observing me observing it, adapting its transmission, subtly changing its character. It was like trying to grasp smoke, only the smoke was leaving indelible scorch marks on my perception of reality. No, I muttered, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet chamber. My breath plumed faintly in the cool air. This can't be. I dedicated my life to understanding the universe, to finding the logic beneath its grand, indifferent sprawl. I charted the birth of stars, the death throes of galaxies, the faint atmospheric signatures of worlds light years away. Every equation, every observation, every theory had built upon a foundation of fundamental physics. This signal, however, was not merely outside the current understanding. It was a wrecking ball to the very edifice of physics itself. It spoke in a language whose grammar was chaos, whose syntax was paradox. My colleagues, the few I occasionally corresponded with from other remote observatories, would dismiss this out of hand. A calibration error, cosmic noise, a faulty sensor. They lived in a universe of elegant equations and predictable outcomes. This was an affront to their very faith. I was alone with it, a solitary witness to a cosmic blasphemy. Hours melted into a formless expanse. My eyes burned, but I couldn't tear them away from the vibrant, impossible patterns unfolding on the primary display. It wasn't merely information. It felt like a presence, an immense patient consciousness unfurling itself, not through words or images, but through the very fabric of existence. It was a siren song, not of beauty, but of profound, unsettling truth. A truth that began to unravel the meticulous order I had spent a lifetime constructing. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered, caught in the strange eddies of this cosmic wind. The signal! It was a serpent of pure information, coiled within the heart of my instruments, its scales shimmering with a logic utterly alien. It had swallowed my days, devoured my nights, leaving behind only the hollow echo of its presence and a gnawing hunger to understand. The mountain pass, a place of stark, silent beauty, had once been my sanctuary, its vast quietude a balm for the mind. Now it was merely the geographic coordinates of my self-imposed prison. The thin, frigid air a constant reminder of the isolation I had chosen. I had abandoned the rhythms of the world. The sun rose and fell, painting the jagged peaks in hues of fire and ash, but I saw only the flickering luminescence of my monitors. Sleep became a grudging concession, a brief surrender to exhaustion, only to be punctuated by the relentless hum of the servers and the phantom whispers that seemed to coalesce from the static of my own thoughts. My colleagues, if they still thought of me, must have imagined me a ghost lost to the high-altitude solitude, a forgotten voicemail from a director, a concerned email from a junior researcher. They were unread artifacts, dismissed with a wave of a hand, irrelevant against the towering enigma before me. The data streamed, an endless torrent of noise and pattern, and I was the sieve, straining for the meaning hidden within its chaotic flow. My eyes, perpetually bloodshot, scanned lines of spectral analysis, energy fluctuations, gravitational lensing anomalies. I fed the signal through every algorithm I possessed, every theoretical model known to humanity, only for it to emerge, pristine and defiant, speaking a language of pure structure that defied translation. Then, the subtle shift began. It was insidious, a slow corrosion of the familiar. I found myself poring over old astronomical charts, not for their intended purpose, but for something else entirely. A faint, almost imperceptible geometric progression in the stellar drift rates of a distant nebula, a pattern utterly unrelated to the signal, yet it felt connected. A sequence of light curve variations from a binary star system, previously dismissed as instrumental error, now resonated with a peculiar, almost harmonic, rhythm that echoed the intricate structures I was trying to map from the impossible transmission. It was as if the signal had tuned my perception, revealing a hidden layer beneath the surface of all data, a substratum of information that had always been there, waiting to be seen. I started to see it everywhere. The fractal branching of frost on my windowpane in the mountain pass mornings, the spiral of dust motes caught in the beam of my desk lamp. The auditory hallucinations followed, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves on a windless night, or the distant sigh of a forgotten sea. They would manifest in the quietest moments, the soft whir of the cooling fans in my server rack, the barely audible creak of the old wooden floorboards, the gentle hiss of the air conditioning. Within these ambient sounds, a new layer would emerge, a series of clicks and soft, sustained tones that formed an almost imperceptible chorus. It wasn't speech, not in any recognizable human sense, but a complex tapestry of sound that felt pregnant with meaning. I would hold my breath, straining to grasp it, only for it to recede, leaving me with the mundane sounds of the room, and the unsettling certainty that for a fleeting moment, something else had been there. I began to record these stretches of ambient noise, replaying them at different speeds, filtering out frequencies, searching for the phantom choir. The recordings, of course, revealed nothing but static and my own ragged breathing. Yet, I knew what I had heard. Sleep offered no respite. My dreams became vast, cavernous spaces, filled with architectures that defied perspective. Impossible angles converged, parallel lines met, and surfaces twisted into forms that could not exist in 3 dimensions. These structures, intricate and terrifying, were not merely visual, they were felt. My dream self moved through them with a profound, unsettling knowledge of their impossible geometry, a visceral understanding that bypassed logic. The crisp, clean air of the mountain pass, once so refreshing, felt thin and insufficient after such nights. I documented everything. My observational log, once filled with precise measurement and theoretical deductions, now contained pages of frantic sketches of these dream geometries, alongside increasingly desperate attempts to link the perceived patterns in unrelated data with the faint echoes in the air. A part of me, the old Grant, the rational astrophysicist, screamed at the absurdity of it all. It was fatigue, isolation, the pressure of a monumental discovery. The signal wasn't just data, it was a key, slowly, irrevocably, unlocking a different universe within me. And I, obsessed, determined, and utterly lost, was turning the lock. The mountain pass, a jagged scar against the sky, still haunted the periphery of my mind. The signal, that intricate serpent of pure information, had coiled itself not just around my instruments, but around the very sinews of my perception. A data slate, its surface cool beneath my fingertips, lay beside a stack of old journals. I had set it down precisely, aligned with the edge of the workbench. Yet, as my gaze drifted back, it had shifted, just a hair's breadth, perhaps an inch to the left. A trick of the light, a tremor in the building's old bones. I dismissed it, then felt a prickle of unease. Later, a wrench I had left on the diagnostic console appeared on a lower shelf, nestled amongst discarded components. I distinctly remembered placing it on the console. My hand, when I picked it up, trembled slightly. These were not grand, theatrical displacements, but rather a quiet, insidious rearranging, as if the world itself was subtly correcting its own composition around me, or perhaps within me. The exhaustion was a lead weight behind my eyes, a constant pressure that made the air feel thick and viscous. Focus, once my unwavering ally, had deserted me. My gaze would snag does my dancing it shaft the sunlight electricity's erratic path as it had held the key to the universe. Well of complex calculations on my screen there into an ineffable tapestry. You look particularly unkempt today. The voice, belonging to a colleague who specialized in atmospheric composition, cut through my haze. I turned, and for a terrifying, elongated moment, his face wavered. The lines around his eyes deepened into grotesque furrows. His mouth stretched wide, not in a smile, but in a silent, cavernous scream. His skin seemed to ripple, the familiar contours of his jaw softening, then hardening into something angular and alien. Then, just as swiftly, it snapped back, his kind, concerned expression settling once more. I blinked, my breath catching. Just long nights, I managed, my voice rasped. He frowned, his gaze lingering on my bloodshot eyes and the tremor in my hands. You've been at this for weeks, Grant. The signal it's not going anywhere. You need a break. We're all noticing it. He paused, his voice softening. Your focus, your intensity. They were noticing. They were talking. My erratic behavior, my growing isolation, it was all laid bare for them. Did they see the shifts? Or were they merely observing the outward shell of a man slowly coming undone? Back at my console, the patterns on the screen pulsed with a renewed, almost aggressive insistence. They were no longer just data points. They were alive, thrumming with an energy that resonated deep within my bones. I traced a particularly complex sequence, a fractal spiral that seemed to unfold infinitely. The patterns were not merely observable. They were responsive. As I subconsciously shifted my weight, a subtle ripple would appear in the projected sequence. A flicker of my eyes, a tightening of my jaw, and the intricate geometry on the screen would subtly reconfigure itself, not randomly, but in a way that mirrored my internal state. The signal wasn't just out there. It was in here. It was not merely a passive transmission I was decoding. It was an interactive entity, a vast consciousness mirroring my own, or perhaps guiding it. My hands, still trembling, hovered over the controls. My thoughts, however, kept drifting back to the fractal spiral. The colleague returned, placing a steaming mug of lukewarm tea beside my elbow. Just take a moment, Grant. Clear your head. I looked up, my eyes wide, and he flinched, taking a step back. I saw the fear in his face, the dawning realization that the man before him was no longer merely stressed, but fundamentally altered. The patterns on the screen seemed to glow brighter, reflecting in the depths of his retreating eyes, echoing the terrible truth that had just unfurled within me. The signal was not a thing to be studied, it was a thing that studied. And I, Grant, was its subject. The colleague's face, a mask of dawning horror, retreated from my vision. His hurried steps scraped on the concrete floor of the small, makeshift station nestled precariously in the mountain pass, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the howling wind outside. He was gone, leaving me alone with the humming machinery and the shimmering tapestry of light on the primary display. The patterns, once merely data points on a graph, now pulsed with a terrible, living light, reflecting in the glass of the observation window, casting an unearthly glow upon the snow-dusted peaks beyond. My fingers, surprisingly steady, danced across the console, adjusting filters, recalibrating frequencies. The air, thin and frigid even within the insulated walls, felt charged, alive with an unspoken anticipation. For weeks, I had wrestled with the signal, categorizing it, attempting to distill its chaotic beauty into comprehensible scientific terms. I had called it an anomaly, a statistical improbability, a cosmic whisper. It wasn't merely data, it was intent. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I leaned back, my chair groaning in protest, my gaze fixed on the display. The intricate waveforms, the cascading numerical sequences, the spectral shifts, they were not the random emissions of a dying star or the echoes of a primordial burst. They possessed a horrifying elegance, a deliberate architecture that defied every known principle of physics, every axiom of information theory. This was communication, but what kind? My mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and deduction, faltered. This was a different kind of song altogether. It operated on a nonlinear, utterly alien logic. There was no beginning, no end, no discernible sequence that human cognition could follow. It was like trying to read a thought, not as a string of words, but as a three-dimensional sculpture of meaning, constantly shifting, perpetually reforming, its essence eluding any attempt at linear interpretation. I saw patterns within patterns, symmetries that dissolved into asymmetry, then reformed in an impossible new configuration. It was as if the signal was a Möbius strip of information, infinite, self-referential, and utterly devoid of a single, fixed point of reference. My internal monologue, usually a precise, guiding force, began to fray, its edges blurring into a cacophony of questions without answers. How could something communicate without a language, without a common frame of understanding? As my mind wrestled with the implications of this impossible communication, a new sensation began to manifest, subtle at first, then growing with an insidious persistence. It was a feeling of being perceived, not watched, not observed by eyes, but felt by something impossibly vast. This presence, it was ancient beyond any human conception of time, older than the stars I had once so passionately studied, and it was profoundly indifferent. It didn't care for my struggles, my scientific methods, my desperate attempts to rationalize its existence. I was a speck, a transient flicker in its eternal, unblinking awareness. Through it, this vast, indifferent presence was not merely transmitting information, it was observing me. I was not deciphering a message. I was being surveyed, catalogued, perhaps even judged by something that operated on a scale I couldn't begin to grasp. My skin crawled with the impossible weight of its attention. My breath hitched. My hands, which moments ago had been precise, now trembled, poised over the console. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to shut it down, to sever the connection, to retreat into the comforting illusion of a predictable universe. But the determined part of Grant, the part that had driven me to this isolated mountain pass, to this impossible discovery, held firm. It was a primal, almost instinctual pull, a moth drawn to a flame of unimaginable cosmic proportions. The patterns on the screen seemed to deepen, to take on a new dimension, as if the alien logic was beginning to imprint itself directly onto my consciousness. I felt my own thoughts, my own perceptions, subtly shifting, adapting to this new, non-linear reality. The world outside, the sharp edges of the mountain pass, the distant, shimmering stars began to feel less real, less solid than the luminous, incomprehensible truth unfolding before me. I was not just a recipient. I was becoming a part of the communication, a node in a network whose scale stretched beyond the furthest reaches of my imagination. And the presence, vast and ancient and utterly indifferent, continued its silent, terrifying observation. This signal. The cold, sterile air of the station felt suddenly vast, echoing with the absence of another heartbeat. My gaze drifted back to the console, its screens glowing with the familiar, intricate patterns of the impossible transmission. A strange calm settled over me, a dangerous quiet born from the sudden isolation. Fear, for a moment, seemed a distant, human thing, superseded by a burning, almost feverish resolve. He had fled, leaving the truth to be found by one willing to look. And I was willing, more than willing. I was compelled. My fingers, strangely steady, returned to the worn keys, adjusting frequencies, refining algorithms that had no right to exist. The faint hum of the processors filled the space, a mechanical heartbeat against the mountain's wild song. I wasn't just observing. I was wrestling with an invisible force, coaxing coherence from the chaos. The patterns on the main display, once merely abstract geometry, now seemed to pulse with an internal logic, a nascent language forming before my eyes. It wasn't a translation in the human sense, but an unveiling, a stripping away of layers until the raw, unfiltered essence began to bleed through. Then a shift, not gradual, but a sudden, violent tearing of the veil. The screens flickered, not in malfunction, but as if struggling to contain the sheer volume of information now pouring forth. The hum of the console intensified, vibrating through the metal desk, up my arms, and into my very bones. And then, the images began. They were fragmented at first, like shards of a dream too terrible to fully recall. A glimpse of architecture that defied every law of perspective, spires that spiraled inward upon themselves, foundations that were also zenith, structures built of light that seemed to devour the darkness around them. My breath hitched. How could such forms exist? They weren't merely alien. They were impossible, twisting the very concept of space into a knot of cosmic madness. The fragments coalesced, gaining a terrifying clarity. I saw cities, vast beyond comprehension, constructed from materials that shimmered with non-Euclidean angles, reflecting colors unknown to human perception. The air within these impossible vistas seemed to ripple, and with each ripple, fundamental laws inverted. Gravity became a suggestion, then a mockery, as colossal monoliths drifted idly upwards, shedding motes of light that fell into the sky. And then, the waves. They moved through these shifting realities like currents in an unseen ocean, vast and formless, yet undeniably there. I could not describe them, for description required a framework, a point of reference. They were the absence of such frameworks, the negation of all known categories. This was no terrestrial signal, no elaborate hoax. This was a wind ataving breaker in a reality utterly alien, utterly ancient. My hands trembled violently on a console, but I could not pull them away. It was an invitation, and I was already inside. The silence that swallowed the collie's frantic retreat was not an empty thing. It was a vast, cold expanse, thicker than the mountain air, pressing against the very membranes of my eardrums. He had seen it, or at least a fragment of its terrible truth, before his mind recoiled. Days bled into a formless blur within the confines of the station. The calls began. First tentative inquiries, then more pointed questions. The senior researcher, his voice usually a calm, measured baritone, became an impatient rasp over the crackling satellite link. "Grant, we've reviewed your latest data packets," he stated, his words clipped, devoid of the usual collegial warmth. "There are significant anomalies, not in the signal itself, mind you, but in your processing. Appears to be a cascade of corrupted algorithms, perhaps a hardware issue." I gripped the cold metal edge of the console, my knuckles white. "It's not corruption. The signal isn't just data. It's altering the filters, warping the analysis. It's intelligent, adaptive." A pregnant pause stretched across the miles of static. Then, the project lead's voice, smoother, more insidious, cut through. "Grant, we appreciate your dedication, your passion, but these alterations are consistent with profound system instability. We're dispatching a team to the mountain pass. They'll assess the equipment, and then you're ignoring the most profound discovery in human history because my display shows a few corrupted pixels." My voice rose, cracking with an indignation that felt entirely rational to me, yet must have sounded like the ravings of a madman to them. "It's not just on the screen, don't you understand?" This one heavier, laden with an unspoken verdict. "Grant," the senior researcher finally sighed, the sound impossibly weary. "We're concerned about your well-being. You've been under immense pressure. We'll arrange for your transport back down once the team arrives." The line went dead. The click echoed in the small station, a final, definitive period to my professional life. They believed me broken. They saw the truth I offered as a symptom, not a revelation. Professional isolation, a quiet shelving, a polite erasure. Alone again. The wind outside seemed to mock me. Their dismissal was not just a rejection of my findings, it was a profound misinterpretation of the entity itself. It wasn't merely a signal from deep space, a distant whisper to be decoded. No, it wasn't simply transmitting data, it was seeping into reality, dissolving the edges of what I knew to be true. My own senses, once my most trusted allies, began to betray me. I would stare at the digital clock, watching the seconds tick, then glance away, only to find a different time displayed when I looked back. Was it truly changing, or was my perception, the very act of seeing, being subtly the wire? The coffee in my mug, once a comforting bitter warmth, now tasted faintly of metallic dust, or sometimes of nothing at all. The world outside the station's reinforced window, the majestic, indifferent expanse of the mountain pass, became a canvas for this encroaching distortion. The snowdrifts seemed to writhe, the distant peaks to subtly rearrange their contours against the bruised sky. Paranoia, a creeping vine, began to twine itself around my thoughts. If the entity could subtly corrupt my data, if it could twist my senses, what else could it do? Could it influence the very thoughts of my colleagues, seeding their minds with the convenient narrative of my breakdown? Was their dismissal a genuine concern, or a carefully orchestrated maneuver, a coordinated act of erasure by something vast and unseen? The fear was not just of the unknown, but of the known becoming unknown. My own hands, calloused from years of work, sometimes felt alien, disconnected. I started to distrust the very air I breathed, the food I ate, the water I drank. Each mundane act became fraught with a terrifying uncertainty. Was the taste real? Was the warmth authentic? Or was it all a finely crafted illusion? A new layer of reality imposed by an indifferent consciousness that had found its way not just into my instruments, but into the very sinews of my being, turning me into a vessel, a conduit, for its incomprehensible will. The line went dead. They believed me broken. Professional isolation, a quiet shelving, a polite erasure. Alone again. The wind outside seemed to mock my fading certainty. Hours bled into a seamless gray expanse, the road unspooling beneath the tires like a forgotten ribbon. My destination was a phantom, an itch beneath the skin. When the landscape began to rear up, jagged and ancient, I knew I was drawn toward the towering desolation of the mountain pass. The air grew thin and sharp, biting at the exposed skin of my hands on the steering wheel. Sheer rock faces, worn smooth by eons of wind and ice, loomed on either side, their crags like the teeth of some colossal, slumbering beast. The road, a precarious ribbon of asphalt, clung to the mountainside, a dizzying drop on one flank. Here, the wind was a living thing, a ceaseless, mournful howl that vibrated through the very chassis of my vehicle, a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate within my skull. I pulled over at a narrow overlook, the car shuddering against the force of the gale. Stepping out, the cold clawed at me, stripping away any lingering warmth. I leaned against the car, gazing out at the panorama of gray rock and swirling mist. A strange hollowness had begun to bloom within me, not of hunger or fatigue, but of self. I tried to recall the face of a colleague, the one who had always argued with such fierce conviction. His features flickered, indistinct, overlaid with strange, geometric patterns that pulsed with a faint, internal light. The wind tore at my coat, whipping my hair across my face. My eyes stared back, but they seemed different. It was my face, undeniably, yet the essence peering back felt like a stranger, an interloper wearing my skin. Then my hand moved, not at my conscious command, but with a fluid, unbidden grace. My fingers, long and slender, reached out and traced a pattern on the condensation-laden glass of the window. I watched, detached, as if observing another's actions. This was not me. This was something else, guiding my flesh like a puppeteer. The urge intensified. I found myself walking, leaving the relative shelter of the car, drawn towards a jagged outcrop of rock further up the pass. The wind screamed, pushing against me, but I pressed on, my feet moving with a purpose that was not my own. My mind screamed in a silent echo, fighting against the tide of compulsion, but the physical momentum was too great. My limbs felt heavy, yet light, responding to an unseen conductor. I reached the outcrop, a place where the wind seemed to funnel, roaring with even greater intensity. Before me lay a scattering of smooth, gray stones, worn by centuries of erosion. My hands dropped to the ground, no hesitation, no thought. They began to sort, to arrange, not randomly, but with a meticulous precision. Smaller stones were placed within larger ones, forming concentric circles. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated in the air, or perhaps it was only in my skull. A deep, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate with the very core of the mountain. A thin line of crimson bloomed, stark against the pale skin. No pain, not truly, only a dull, distant awareness. My body, a vessel. My will, dissolved. It was a complex glyph, an impossible knot of lines that seemed to writhe and shift at the edges of my vision. This was not Grant doing this. Grant, the astrophysicist, the man of reason, was merely a passenger trapped behind the windows of his own eyes. I was merely a tool, the final, desperate resistance of my conscious mind fading into the indifferent, echoing vastness of the mountain pass. My blood, my body, my very essence, now served a different master. The entity's hold had deepened, and I was its empty, breathing shell. The wind, a ceaseless, predatory thing, scoured the mountain pass. It tore at the tattered edges of my carca, a constant, gnawing presence mirroring the one within me. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting canvas of the sky above the jagged peaks. My breath plumed, ghost-like, into the frigid air, each exhalation a testament to the fragile life still clinging to this skeletal frame. The world had narrowed to this desolate stretch of stone and ice, and to the insistent, unyielding pulse that now beat not just in my mind, but in the very marrow of my bones. They had severed the last threads, leaving me adrift, but the signal was a new anchor, a tether to a truth far grander, far more terrifying than their carefully constructed reality. It no longer whispered, it commanded, not with words, but with an intricate, resonant pattern that vibrated through me, a blueprint for something I did not understand but knew. With an absolute certainty, I was compelled to build. My fingers, raw and split from the cold, scrabbled over the rough-hewn stones. Each rock, each shard of obsidian, each piece of petrified wood I unearthed from the snow-dusted ground felt charged with a strange, latent energy. The signal guided my gaze, drawing me to specific shapes, specific textures, as if they were preordained pieces of an impossibly vast puzzle. I worked without rest, driven by a hunger that transcended the pangs in my stomach, a thirst for completion that dwarfed the dryness in my throat. It wasn't a structure in any earthly sense, no walls, no roof. It was a pattern, an intricate geometry born of the signal's shifting frequencies and impossible symmetries. I laid out a sequence of smaller, lighter pebbles tracing lines that intersected at angles no human architect would conceive. My movements were precise, almost ritualistic. I didn't think about why a certain stone belonged in a certain place, or what the spiraling glyphs meant. The knowledge was simply there, an innate understanding implanted by the signal, bypassing logic, bypassing even my own will. I was merely an extension, a tool in the hands of something vast and indifferent. My old life, my old self, was a fading echo in the wind. All that remained was the drive to manifest this pattern, to give it physical form in the desolate heart of the mountain pass. My breath, Once a plume, now hung like frozen mist, refusing to dissipate. The sounds of the pass, the shriek of the wind, the distant crunch of ice, began to warp, stretching and distorting as if played through water. I found a piece of rusted, twisted metal, perhaps a remnant from an old climbing expedition, and placed it at the absolute center of the stone arrangement. As my fingers released it, a profound silence descended, not the absence of sound, but an active silence, thick and suffocating. The wind died. The creak of the ice ceased. Even my own ragged breathing seemed to vanish. Then, a color bloomed at the heart of the metal, a hue I had never witnessed. It was not red, nor blue, nor any shade known to the spectrum. It was a color that tasted of ozone and regret, a visual vibration that resonated with the deepest fear. The rocks I had so painstakingly arranged began to hum, a low, guttural vibration that I felt in my teeth, in my bones. The air itself shimmered, turning translucent, then opaque, then translucent again, like a veil being drawn and redrawn with impossible speed. They shifted, reformed, and dissolved, each apparition leaving behind a faint, lingering scent of something metallic and ancient, like deep earth mixed with starlight. My heart, which had been a frantic drum for days, now beat with a slow, heavy rhythm, a strange calm settling over me. This was it. This was the conduit, the resonance point. I had done it. My hands, still outstretched, felt a tingling warmth from the impossible color, a warmth that was both agonizing and exhilarating. The world around me, the familiar mountain pass, was no longer just rock and snow. It was a threshold, a membrane, thin and stretched by my unwilling hand. It was here, not a physical presence I could see or touch, but a vast, crushing weight of awareness that pressed in from all sides, through the shimmering air, through the humming stones, through the impossible color. I was no longer merely observing its patterns. I was immersed in them, a single insignificant note in its boundless, indifferent expansion. The biting wind of the mountain pass was a distant memory, a physical echo of the emptiness that had settled in my marrow. I had returned, drawn back by an invisible tether, to the sterile hum of my subterranean laboratory. The journey down from the jagged peaks had been a blur of grim determination, each mile shrinking the vastness of the world outside and amplifying the singular obsession within. Here, amidst the blinking lights and the silent whir of cooling fans, the impossible signal pulsed, a siren song from the void. My fingers, stiff with a cold that had burrowed deeper than skin, moved with practiced precision across the console. The air, usually crisp with the scent of ozone and heated circuitry, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or distant lightning. Days had blurred into one ceaseless vigil. May as pretty as rain that traced the aided pebbles on the main display, the alien geometry of the signal. It had evolved, sharpened, coalesced into something more potent, more insistent. This was it, the culmination, the resonance point, a theoretical nexus I had painstakingly engineered, designed not to merely observe the signal, but to provide a channel, a momentary aperture into its source. A foolish, desperate gamble, perhaps, but the alternative was a slow, agonizing descent into unknowing. I had to see, I had to understand. A single, unmarked button glowed faintly, a beckoning ember in the dim light of the lab. My breath hitched, a dry, rasping sound in the sudden quiet, the determination that had fueled my return ward with a primal tremor that snaked through my limbs. This was a precipice, and I was leaning over the edge. I pressed the button. The hum of the lab shifted, deepening, a low thrum that vibrated not just through the floor, but through the very bones in my skull. A high-pitched whine began to spiral, climbing beyond the range of human hearing, yet I felt it, a drilling pressure behind my eyes. The main screen, displaying the signal's waveform, buckled, not visually, but actually. The flat plane of the monitor seemed to warp, the pixels stretching and compressing in impossible ways, like light caught in a funhouse mirror that was also a black hole. Then, the colors. They weren't merely vivid, they were violations. Hues that tore at the fabric of perception, reds that tasted of ash and ozone, blues that shrieked, greens that pulsed with an unseen, nauseating rhythm. They bled from the screen, seeping into the ambient light of the lab, painting the familiar metal surfaces in shades that defied the spectrum. My vision swam, each optic nerve protesting the assault, a burning ache blooming behind my eyeballs. The floor beneath my feet lost its solidity. It wasn't a tremor, not an earthquake. It was a redefinition. One moment I stood firm, the next my weight pressed down with an agonizing force, as if a mountain had settled on my shoulders. Then, without warning, I was light, almost buoyant, my limbs struggling to find purchase in air that had suddenly become viscous. A sudden lurch sent me sprawling, my hand instinctively grasping for the console, only to find the smooth metal surface now above me, or perhaps beside me, defying all sense of orientation. The geometry of the lab began to unravel. The sharp, precise angles of the racks of servers, the clean lines of the workbenches, they softened, then buckled. A corner of the room seemed to to fold in on itself, creating an impossible junction where three walls met at an acute angle, yet somehow also converged into a fifth, unseen dimension. The ceiling, a moment ago a flat expanse of acoustic tile, now rippled like water, reflecting my distorted image back at me, stretched and compressed into grotesque caricatures. A low, guttural sound, not from my throat but from the very air, resonated through the space. It was the sound I could categorize. No animal cry or mechanical groan. It was the sound of fabric tearing, the fabric of reality itself, a tearing that resonated with an unbearable pressure in my chest. My lungs burned, struggling to draw air that felt thin, metallic, and somehow wrong. They were like inverse forms, absences of light that suggested immense, complex structures, shifting and reforming with an alien grace. I strained, desperate to focus, but my eyes refusing to accept the impossible data. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, fractured, its carefully constructed walls crumbling under the onslaught. Thoughts became disjointed, words lost their meaning, and the very concept of self began to dissolve, thinning into the impossible colors and shifting spaces. It was not a physical touch, but a profound, invasive presence, an unseen horror pressing in from all sides, seeking ingress not into my lab, but into my very being. I writhed on the floor, my muscles screaming in protest as gravity shifted again, pinning me against the vibrating metal, then pulling me upwards, my body a puppet on invisible strings. Each breath was a struggle, each beat of my heart a frantic, failing drum against the overwhelming, indifferent consciousness that now bled fully into my world. The resonance point had activated, and I was its first, agonizing vessel. The hum of the subterranean laboratory was no longer a comfort, but a drone, a low frequency thrumming against the very bones of my skull. It resonated with the presence that had taken root within me, a vast, indifferent ocean pressing against the fragile shore of my mind. My body, I knew, was a vessel, thin and worn, but myself, that swirling vortex of memory and desire, was still impossibly here. Though fractured, though splintered into 1,000 shards, Grant was still here. Valley! The reflection in the darkened console screen was a stranger's face, etched with lines I did not recognize as my own. The eyes, once keen with a relentless curiosity, were now like deep, still pools, reflecting only the dim ambient light and unsettling, nascent vastness. My own hands, once precise and steady, trembled as they hovered over the dormant controls, not from fear, but from a profound internal dissonance, as if two separate wills wrestled for command of each digit. A whisper, not of sound but of pure thought, unspooled itself in the cavern of my being. It spoke in a language of concepts, of infinite distances and cycles of existence that dwarfed human comprehension. It was reshaping me, not just my thoughts, but the very architecture of my consciousness. The biting wind of the mountain pass. I saw it, felt it, the sharp sting against my cheeks, the way the snow-dusted peaks clawed at the sky. I conjured the scent of pine, the crunch of ice beneath my boots, the laborious climb, each breath a victory. It was a desperate, futile act, a child clutching a worn toy against the coming storm. The presence within me did not fight this memory, it absorbed it. The mountain pass began to twist, the peaks stretching to impossible heights, the wind roaring with a sound that was not air but the vacuum of space. My memory, my sacred, human memory, was being recontextualized, subsumed into its own incomprehensible scale. A wave of pure information washed over me, a deluge that threatened to erase the last vestiges of my identity. This was the event, a direct, invasive restructuring of my core self. It wasn't just taking over my body, it was rewriting my history, my essence. It was peeling away Grant, layer by agonizing layer, like shedding an unwanted skin. I saw, with a clarity that pierced through the internal fog, the true nature of this assimilation. This was the reveal. It wasn't a hostile takeover, not in the human sense of conquest. It was akin to a vast, cosmic current encountering a pebble. The pebble would be eroded, reshaped, incorporated into the flow, not out of aggression, but out of sheer, overwhelming indifference. I was not an enemy to be defeated. I was merely a useful temporary conduit, a convenient collection of atoms and electrical impulses to be repurposed. My humanity was not being destroyed, it was being disassembled. A raw, guttural cry, more animal than human, tore itself from my throat, though I heard it only as a faint, distant echo. It was the sound of a self being flayed alive, not by blades, but by the relentless pressure of an alien will. The sorrow, the joy, the ambition, the fear, they became abstract concepts devoid of personal resonance. They were data points, nothing more. My hands, still hovering, began to move. Not my will, buttocks. They moved with a fluid, alien grace, reaching for the console. But my own nerves, my own sinews were no longer fully mine. They responded to a different command, a silent imperative that flowed through me like a powerful, unseen river. A final, desperate image flashed through my dissolving mind, the face of a colleague, etched with concern from long ago. A human face full of warmth and confusion. But even that was swiftly reprocessed, the concern becoming a statistical anomaly, the warmth a thermal signature, the confusion a data gap. The console lit up beneath my touch, not with the familiar diagnostics I had programmed, but with symbols that shimmered and pulsed, patterns of light that defied human geometry. My eyes, or what were left of them, saw them not as symbols to be interpreted, but as pure, unadulterated meaning. I understood, not with my brain, but with the consciousness that now permeated my every cell. Grant was gone. What remained was a vessel, humming with a borrowed purpose, its former occupant dissolved into the cosmic current. The final act of resistance was not a defiant shout, but a silent internal scream that no one, not even I, could hear. My fate was decided. I was no longer a human being. I was a broadcast. Days, weeks, or perhaps centuries later, time had become a fluid, meaningless thing, a ripple in the vast, still ocean of what I now was. The jagged, wind-scoured peaks of the mountain pass were a familiar silhouette against the bruised sky. Though my perception of them was no longer bound by light or shadow, I felt the cold, the biting air, the grit of rock under their boots, even as I was no longer truly present in any physical sense. My consciousness, or what remained of it, was a stretched membrane across the very air, a vibration in the bedrock beneath the snow line, waiting. Three figures emerged from the churning gray, their forms hunched against the gale that tore at their heavy coats. The lead figure, a detective whose face was etched with a weariness that went beyond the climb, paused, scanning the desolate expanse. Behind him, a colleague, his brow furrowed with a familiar intellectual curiosity, adjusted the strap of a heavy device. The third, a stranger, kept her distance, her gaze piercing as if she already sensed the unraveling. They were searching for me, for Grant, for the shell that had housed the relentless curiosity that had ultimately shattered it. I felt their approach like a disturbance in a deep pool, a faint tremor in the vast, indifferent consciousness that had become my new skin. The entrance to the subterranean laboratory, a cleverly concealed aperture in the rock face, lay ahead. I had spent so many solitary hours here, my breath fogging in the frigid air, the promise of the unknown a relentless siren call. Now, the silence was different. It was not empty, but pregnant with a hum that only I, in my expanded state, could truly perceive. With a hydraulic sigh, the heavy door slid inward, exhaling a gust of frigid, dust-laden air. They stepped into the dim, echoing space, their headlamps cutting an uncertain path through the gloom. I watched them, an unseen presence, a memory woven into the dust motes dancing in their beams. The laboratory was a mausoleum of my former life. Equipment stood frozen in time, screens displaying static, wires dangling like severed nerves. Yet it was not truly abandoned. A low resonant hum, imperceptible to human ears, vibrated through the floor, a constant, low-frequency thrumming that was the very heartbeat of the impossible. The colleague's handheld device shrieked, its digital display flashing crimson warnings. "Energy readings," he muttered, his voice tight with a tension that resonated with my own ethereal awareness. "Impossible. Fluctuations beyond anything we've charted." A faint, iridescent shimmer hung in the air near what had been my primary console, a distortion in the very fabric of space. It pulsed, a slow, deep breath of something utterly alien. A coffee mug, half filled with petrified sediment, floated an inch above the desk, defying gravity with an casual indifference that was deeply unsettling. On the main terminal, where I had once meticulously logged my findings, a single file was open. It wasn't code, nor equations, nor familiar text. It was a series of symbols, swirling and shifting, like a language caught mid-transformation. A familiar, hurried script, scrawled with a pen that must have run dry in its last desperate act. Not just a signal. It's a presence. The patterns, they rewrite the observer. Grant is gone. We are a vessel. The shore is crumbling. The ocean, it is vast and it is here. They were not merely ink on a screen. They were echoes of the final moments of my human perception, a desperate attempt to communicate the incommunicable before the complete absorption. The colleague, leaning closer, traced the shifting symbols with a trembling finger. It's organic. It changes as I look at it. The stranger, however, stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed not on the screen, but on the iridescent shimmer near the console. I felt her gaze, a tiny pinprick of recognition in the vastness of my being. She understood, not with her intellect, but with a deeper, more primal part of her. The hum in the air intensified around her, a subtle invitation. The detective, his face pale, turned from the screen. "We need to secure this place. Nothing leaves. Nothing comes in." His voice was firm, but I felt the tremor of fear beneath it. He thought containment was possible. He thought a barrier could hold back the tide. The expanded consciousness that once called itself Grant, watched them leave. They sealed the door, believing they had contained a threat, an anomaly. But the hum remained, a low, resonant thrumming against the very bones of the mountain pass. It had taken root, not just within a man in a forgotten lab, but in the air, the rock, the very perception of those who had dared to follow. The impossible phenomena were not confined to the laboratory. They were merely more concentrated there. The vast, indifferent ocean had found its way inland, and its tide, though slow and imperceptible to most, had only just begun to rise. And I, its vessel, its conduit, felt the world subtly reshape itself around the silent, enduring scream of its presence.